Hi, my name is Will, and this is the 8th video in a series about the DC Comics character Martian Manhunter. This will be about the limited series Jemm, Son of Saturn, which John technically doesn't appear in, so why am I going to talk about this 12-issue series? Well, in 1984, two writers planned on bringing back John. Greg Potter was writing a series about a new Martian character, and it was very much a continuation of Dennis O'Neil's stories about the Martian people. But Gerry Conway was also planning to bring John back and tell a story that was very much a continuation of O'Neil's stories about the Martian people. Gerry Conway was the guy writing the Justice League, and he overrules the guy writing a limited series. So Greg Potter changed his story from being about Martians to being about Saturnians, people from Saturn. Now we'll talk about Gerry Conway's closing chapter on the saga of the Martian people in the next video, but I want to briefly talk about Greg Potter's story and his plans for the Martian people in his 12-issue limited series that I believe was meant to be called Jemm, Son of Mars, and became retooled as Jemm, Son of Saturn. Okay, so Greg Potter had already written several issues of his limited series when he was told he couldn't use John or the Martians, so he changed them to Saturnians. Now, I'm not sure if he looked back at previous aliens in DC described as Saturnians, but John does encounter red-skinned aliens from Saturn in the past, and they had many of his abilities. Maybe this helped him pick a color. But while Potter changes the Martians to Saturnians, the story is very much a continuation of O'Neil's stories. I will give an overview of the story and then talk about some of the interesting details. The story centers around a Martian named Jemm, a Saturnian named Jemm. Jemm is essentially a Martian Saturnian prince who manifests the family trait of having a gem on his forehead that gives him special empathic and destructive powers. Now, these powers would eventually be powers that John had, but at this point in time he didn't have them, so they were unique to Jemm. Using the gem, his forebears had united Mars, Saturn, but their reign had failed, and Mars, Saturn, descended into civil war with Jogarr leading the green-skinned, red-skinned faction, and Blanks, Sinar, leading the skinned faction. Mars, Saturn, ends up being devastated by an out-of-control blue flame, malfunctioning atom buster. And Jemm ends up as a lone survivor, who then goes to Earth. That's the same too. He uses his special power to connect to the emotions of others to befriend a young black kid, Luther. But Jemm is being hunted by a band of white Martians, Saturnians, who escape Mars, Saturn, in a fleet of spaceships they were building as part of the war effort. They want to use Jemm to find the last of the green Martians, red Saturnians, in order to continue the war and wipe them out. The US government discovers the white Martian Saturnians spaceship and enlists Superman to investigate. Superman confirms that Mars, Saturn, is a dead world since he saw the result of the Martian Saturnians Civil War, and he went with John to Mars to stop Blanks in Justice League of America 71. No corollary. Superman finds Jemm, and Jemm can't communicate with him. They have the typical hero misunderstanding fight, and Superman defeats Jemm. But a human agent turns on him and stuns him. The white Martian Saturnians then show up and capture Jemm and Luther, and accidentally save Superman by killing the rogue government agent. These Martians Saturnians try to make Jemm reveal the location of Mars 2, New Bok. Meanwhile, a recovered Superman who actually knows the location of learns it with Hawkman's Absorbiscon, Mars 2, New Bok, goes to Mars 2, New Bok, and talks to his old friend John, the Martian Jogarr, who strangely speaks English and knows who Superman is. Without John Jogarr doesn't want Jemm to come to Mars 2, New Bok, because John Jogarr loves democracy and doesn't want to return to the monarchy that Jemm presents. Superman poignantly pleads Jemm's case, saying that believing you are the last of your kind is incredibly lonely, and both John and Superman both believe this at certain points. Superman says that Jemm should at least be told. John finally relents and sets out to find his cousin Jemm. Meanwhile, Jemm and Luther have escaped from the white Martians and returned to Earth, but the whites continue their pursuit. Luckily, John shows up in time to save Jemm by using the Martian weakness to fire. John, Jemm, and Luther return to Mars 2, where Jemm's presence causes some political instability due to his religious significance. Meanwhile, the white Martians make an alliance with a rich and powerful human, Claudius Tull, who is able to give them the location of Mars 2. They launch an attack to wipe out the Green Martians. The Green Martians are ready and have a super weapon to defend themselves, but Jemm destroys it in order to save the white Martians, causing the green Martians to turn against him. The green Martians then launch a fleet to do battle with the superior white Martian fleet. Claudius Tull, who gave the whites the location of Mars 2, then neutralizes both fleets and plans to consume the life energies of all the Martians. He wipes out most of the whites before he is killed by a renegade employee. This turns the tide so that Jemm and the green Martians can defeat the whites and force them to surrender. In the end, Jemm does not stay on Mars 2 and returns to Earth to save Luther, who had become a hostage, and to search for another Martian who is on Earth. This 12-issue series probably has a larger page count than every other Jemm appearance during the Bronze Age, and I very much glossed over it, but I do want to go over some points. One is the retelling of Jemm's story as Jogar's story, and the changes that might have been intended for Jemm. One part of this is that Jogarr is a member of the royal family, which actually accounts for some of his powers. But Jogarr wasn't in line for the throne, prompting him to study Earth and embrace democracy. This study of democracy ends up getting him democratically elected to lead the Red Saturnian faction. He then engages in the Civil War that was copied from Justice League of America 71. Jogarr has a duel with the white faction leader Sinar that mirrors the duel Jemm had with Blanks before his exile. And while Jemm gets exiled to Earth and returns after this exile to find a ruined Mars, Jogarr is enslaved and forced to work in a mine, which ironically saves his life when the planet is destroyed. He emerges from the mine to find a ruined Mars. Like Jemm, Jogarr directs his people to build a space ark, and like Jemm, he fights the leader of the enemy faction in a final duel. Although, in the Jogarr version, it feels like a weird afterthought. Jogarr then ends up as the ruler of a new colony of his people, just like Jemm. So this switch from Jemm to Jogarr ends up messing up several scenes with Superman reuniting with Jemm. Now, Superman had been there for every story with Martians, and he was brought into this story, but then a lot of his connections to those other stories kind of fall apart. He announces that he knows that Saturn has been dead for years because he has been there. In this modified story, that doesn't really connect to anything, but originally this was Superman stating the facts of Justice League of America 71 when he went to Mars with Jemm and saw that it had been destroyed. The scene where he finds the colony New Bok using the Absorbiscon and meets the English-speaking Jogarr was clearly meant to be him already knowing where New Bok was, a major plot point from World's Finest 245, and then uniting with his old friend Jemm. And the scene where Superman convinces Jogarr to help Jemm has a part where Superman talks about believing you are the last of your species. In this book, that directly relates to Superman, but also related to Jemm, who briefly believed he was the last Martian, before he learned that some others had escaped from Mars on a space ark. In Jogar's story, he is never the last Saturnian, so this point is kind of missed. One Jogarr detail that I do like a lot is that Jogarr actually has a very negative attitude towards Jemm at first. And that's because of politics. While Jogarr has royal blood, he is an elected leader and a proponent of democracy, while Jemm is royalty and a prophesied savior. Many stories with royalty often present that as a reasonable way to determine a ruler, buying into the idea that they are somehow genetically or morally superior. Because you are of this bloodline, you should rule. The story has a prince character, but the Jogarr character specifically calls out that this is stupid, and that democracy is better, which frankly is an opinion I agree with. But while presenting this opinion, the story does explicitly give the royal bloodline certain powers. Jemm has his forehead gem that gives him special abilities, including powerful empathic abilities, while royal blood gives both Jemm and his cousin Jogarr the ability to fly. This may have been a way to handle the disparity of Jemm using flight while most Martians didn't. So while the story expresses the opinion that democracy is superior, the royals are actually genetically and morally superior. Morally because of the empathic powers that allow them to recognize that Martians are all basically the same under the skin. But other genetic lines also have powers. Certain white soldiers called Kulars were bred to have special abilities that allowed them to possess and animate inanimate objects, a power Jemm had actually used once long ago. So special abilities are not limited to the royal family, and there seemed to be an intent to say that some of Jemm's specific powers came from his bloodline, and not just from his being a Martian. In terms of basic powers, the Saturnians are very much like O'Neill's Martians. They are strong and tough, but that's about it. They don't feel too special. Jemm battles Superman, but can't really hurt him, and Superman knocks him out easily. Jemm does display the ability to change his shape, but this is limited to stretching himself, and he never turns into anything or anybody else. And no other Saturnians seem to display this power either. The weakness is notably changed, though. Instead of the presence of fire weakening them, Saturnians are highly flammable. When they burst into flames, they also become unable to think. Jogarr passes out when he is on fire, and Jemm is unable to do anything as well. But it's a little weird because Jemm also doesn't get burned the way a person would, and he recovers quickly from going up like a torch. This is a kind of cool take on the fire weakness, but in this case it is applied to Saturnians and not Martians. One more thing about this story that I wanted to briefly talk about is race. The fundamental story is about hate between two groups, the Reds and the Whites. The central character Jemm has empathic power, and this power gives him the ability to understand that the two groups are fundamentally the same. He wants to try and heal the divide between the groups, but he himself is caught in a cycle of hatred and violence. He is a Red Saturnian who is hunted by Whites, and he can't help but react to that. The story doesn't offer a solution or a happy ending in this regard, but it is clear that racism and the hatred between the two groups that they can't let go of is the central tragedy. And Potter tackling race doesn't just live in the Reds versus Whites allegory. He actively adds black characters because he understands that that segment of the population was very underrepresented in comics. Now, these characters don't deal with much racism, but they are presented as living a poor and difficult urban lifestyle often associated with black people, and that is humanized by these characters. Now, Jemm, son of Mars, was turned into Jemm, son of Saturn, because Gerry Conway wanted to bring back the Martian Manhunter to be in the Justice League. And just like Jemm felt like a chapter in O'Neill's story about the Martian people, Conway's story also feels like a chapter in that story. In the next video, I will talk about how Conway writes the closing chapter on the Martian people. Like, subscribe, and comment if you want to encourage me to keep making content.